All right, welcome everybody. We will get started in just about 30 seconds more. Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the Family Information Session. It's outlining some changes in communicating student learning. This session will be recorded tonight so that we can send the link out to families that weren't able to make it at this time. But a warm welcome to all the families that are here with us today. Let's start by acknowledging with respect and that we are grateful to be hosting this meeting from the unceded and traditional lands and waters of the Sechelt and the Squamish Nation as we gather, learn, and collaborate with one another tonight. As educators, we have a professional responsibility to examine past practice and to move forward with strategies that benefit all of our learners, including our Indigenous learners. And the work we're going to do tonight, we'll talk about the innovations in instruction and in assessment that we think will really benefit all of our learners. We want to surface the stories of children as they move forward in their learning. And we want our assessment practices to reflect this learning and their growth. We want students and families to be engaged in ongoing communication and for the voices and stories of children to be surfaced in our assessment and our reporting practices. So a warm welcome to those of us who are able to join in to this webinar. I am Kirsten Deasy. I'm District Principal of Learning, Innovation, and Childcare. And I'm really thrilled to also have Desiree Harris with us today, the Vice Principal of Chatlick Secondary. Our agenda tonight, we're going to start with some of the why and the research behind some of the changes. And we'll then outline some of the updates. We'll talk about the provincial proficiency scale in some depth because we've had some questions about that. And we want to really support families with understanding what the proficiency scale is and why we're moving towards a system. And then we're going to hear from a principal's perspective. And Desiree is going to share some of her experiences as a principal using proficiency scales and standards-based assessment. We'll then talk about descriptive feedback and how parents will receive the comments and the feedback that come out to you in your learning updates. So that's the agenda for tonight. So student reporting. The way that teachers and schools communicate student learning and the format of traditional report cards is shifting. And we wanted to have this webinar to really provide an opportunity to outline some of these changes and to also answer some questions. So we put out this opportunity to participate in this webinar and to send questions ahead. And we had lots of families sending questions. So we've embedded them into tonight's webinar. So we've done our best to answer all of your questions. And at the end, we'll talk about the process for if there's more questions, what we can do to make sure that we're communicating well together. So why is student reporting changing? Let's just back up and think about this question. Why are we doing changes? What's going on? Well, we know that 65% of children entering school today will ultimately end up working in a completely new job type that doesn't yet exist. So the world is moving so fast, and with this rapidly changing world, we can't even begin to imagine what types of jobs might exist when our kindergarten students graduate. So that the World Economic Forum and OECD and all sorts of international agencies have been really working on how are we going to educate students to prepare for a future that we can't even imagine. I love this quote. Our job is not to prepare students for something. Our job is to help students prepare themselves for anything. And I think it's important to just back up and think about our curriculum. We had our curriculum redesigned, and this was implemented back in September of 2016. And it introduced a know, do, and understand curriculum, which focused on the big ideas of understanding, general ideas and principles that we want students to understand. It also incorporates the know part of knowing content and learning standards. And it introduced the doing part, which is the competency-driven part of the curriculum, because we find that the more students are really engaged in doing the learning, the deeper and more transferable their learning becomes. So this new curriculum is concept-based and competency-driven. And it's actually not really new because it was introduced in September 2016. But it's personalized so that we can adapt and meet the needs of each of the individuals in our classes. It's flexible so that we have flexibility in how we meet children's needs, the accommodations, the way we work within our curriculum. It also introduced core competencies. So core competencies are really important. It's again part of the competency-driven piece of the curriculum, where competencies are long-lasting. They're things like thinking, critical thinking and creative thinking, and communication, social and personal responsibility. So these are much longer lasting than discrete things like skills. Our curriculum also focuses on literacy and numeracy foundations. So those are embedded throughout the curriculum, as are Indigenous perspectives and student content. Those are woven into all areas and all grades. And while the current provincial curriculum began to be implemented in 2016, the ministry's reporting policy has stayed largely unchanged since 1994. So we've been, a lot of work has been done on research around assessment and reporting. So the Ministry of Education and Childcare, I worked really closely with BC universities, UBC, University of Victoria, Vancouver Island University, and they conducted an interjurisdictional review of assessment that was national and international. And what they found from that is that having frequent communication, that's ongoing communication and timely communication, has a positive impact on learning and on engagement, on motivation, and on effort. And so our new reporting policy, you'll see a lot more emphasis on more frequent and back and forth communication with families and with students. and educators. There's also research on a focus on proficiency. Focusing on proficiency really has been shown in the research to improve assessment reliability and student engagement. And self and peer assessments have also emerged through the research to really increase confidence in ability, to improve performance. It provides greater responsibility for students. They take on more of that responsibility for their learning, and they have greater satisfaction with their learning, more independence, and more productive and positive learning environments end up as a result. So a lot of research has been done on this by the province. That provincial policy shifts then were driven for the K-9 system, and these were focused on those academic research results nationally and globally, also by school and district innovations that took place around the province. So for quite a few years now, districts have had the opportunity to innovate when it came to assessment and practice using proficiency. Our district was one of those districts, actually, that engaged in this. Many districts did. 85% of the districts across the province actually engaged in innovations around assessment. And that, too, was part of the research. Also, part of that research was engagement with BC parents and BC educators. So many parents, more than 5,500 parents were engaged in and consulted around these shifts. So a lot of work has been done to really do a comprehensive research analysis and make sure that our practices are moving forward to prepare us for today's and tomorrow's worlds. So after all these years of research and consultation and engagement, we're really excited to announce the K-12 student reporting policy. And that is set to launch for next school year, so 2023-24. And this provides this year as a year of transition for us. In that time, we're going to see shifting language. So you're going to hear us using different types of language than you've heard in the past. So instead of calling things report cards or focusing on reporting, we're going to be focusing on what's called communicating student learning. Because by using that term, communicating student learning, we're really going to have a better or a wider focus on the learning. That's really what we want to emphasize with this new reporting policy, is how closely we're following and communicating about the learning that's taking place in our classrooms. It also really provides that opportunity to have a greater range of how we collect and how we share learning. So descriptives of learning can be captured in e-portfolios, through learning check-ins, through summaries, through conferences, through updates. So a lot more flexibility in how we can communicate student learning. So we're shifting from calling how we report through report cards to learning updates and summaries of learning. And these changes, we think, will really help us align with assessment and reporting that's happening across our curriculum, and also are reflected in our provincial assessments. So we want our assessment practices to really match our curriculum, and also to be assessing in all those major assessment points, such as the grade 4 foundation skills assessments and the grade 7s, the graduation, literacy and numeracy assessments that take place. And universities are starting to pay more and more attention to those graduation ones. I had one question from a family who were asking about that, and they're new. So we are in a period where we're getting those collected and collecting that data, and universities now are starting to pay attention to that. And it's part of what they look at. These updates in student reporting also allow us to ensure more consistency of reporting across all of our BC schools in the province. And they center students and parents and caregivers as equitable partners in the assessment and the reporting process. So the purpose of the updated policy is really to ensure that parents, caregivers, students are well informed on where the child is in their learning and strategies for how to move them forward. Now, our new updated K-12 reporting policy will have 5 learning updates provided to families. 2 of them will be written, and 2 of them will be flexible format, which would be like conferences or 3-way student-led opportunities, open houses. They're very flexible in how we can do that. And we're still in the process of exploring how that might look in our school district. And then a summary of learning will also be provided for all families at the end of the term or in June. The updated policy also embeds student self-reflection of core competencies 3 times a year and goal setting. So we'll have some more information about that, but that will launch next school year. It also embeds the provincial proficiency scale and descriptive feedback from grades kindergarten to grades 9. And we're going to focus on this tonight quite a bit. So we'll highlight what those shifts will look like and why those are taking place. Letter grades and percentages will be provided with descriptive feedback, grades 10 to 12. So those will remain unchanged. But in kindergarten to grade 9, the proficiency scale and descriptive feedback will be replacing grades. We'll be providing graduation status updates for grades 10, 11, and 12 so that students and families of students who are close to graduating are going to be kept really up to date with the progress that they're making towards graduation. And all learners, including students with disabilities or diverse abilities, will receive regular communications of student learning in the same way as their peers in any other program. Now, in elementary, we wanted to focus on some of these changes that are going to happen in the learning updates for elementary school students and their families. So written updates will include proficiency. So we'll talk about the proficiency scale in a moment, and proficiency will be replacing grades. Now, that's not a huge change for lots of our learners. We've used proficiency for many of our learners in School District 46 already. And descriptive feedback will also be providing descriptive feedback for students, which again is not new. Many of us are used to receiving comments through the reporting. And this will focus on strengths, areas for growth, and opportunities for future development. So those will all be embedded into the descriptive feedback that teachers provide for each student. Also embedded in these learning updates will be student voice. So we'll be providing feedback that students will generate on their core competencies. So they'll be engaging in reflections about their core competencies, and they'll also be engaging in goal setting. But we're not going to have any shifts in the schedule. So our calendar is already set for this school year. And that won't change. We'll still have our regular reporting periods of November and March and June, and we'll have those conferencing times about a week later in November and March. Those conferencing times will be the early dismissal dates that are set in the calendar already. So you can expect there won't be any changes in the schedule for this year. We're exploring whether we might want to shift some of the calendar. Maybe it would make sense to have some of the flexible learning updates take place at a different time than right after the learning updates are provided. We will engage in a consultation process, and we'll want to hear from educators and teachers and students about their thoughts about that, and families. And we will see some shifts in what will be communicated and how we'll communicate. So we'll focus on that a little bit now, with a focus on proficiency and descriptive feedback. So this is a year of transition for us in the school district. Some of our teachers are going to stick with traditional reporting formats for this year. Others are going to be moving forward with the updated policy recommendations. So for those families, they'll receive every learning area will be communicated at least twice during the year, including the summary. So every learning area will be reported on or communicated about at least twice during the year, which one of those times could be the learning summary. English language arts and math will be reported on at every learning update and the summary. All other learning areas will be communicated at least once, either in November or March. And a summary of learning will be provided in June, and that will communicate out about all areas of learning. For applied design and technology and for careers, we will only be reporting this year out on the June summary. We just wanted to have this year of transition to have our teachers getting used to this new reporting and provide the updates for families on the June final report. You might hear from it in other times as well, but for sure you will hear about it in the June summary. So this is put a different way. The written updates that you'll receive in November will have information on English language arts and math, and then you'll hear about updates about learning areas that are currently being studied in your child's classroom. And you'll hear about them at least once, either in November or in March. In your second learning update that you'll receive in March, you'll hear about English language arts and mathematics progress, and all of the other learning areas that weren't commented on in the November update. And then that summary of learning in June, it will include descriptive feedback on all 9 of the learning areas, as well as student self-assessments of their core competencies. And these are all the learning areas. There's 9 different learning areas. For secondary, teachers in grades 8 and 9 can choose to communicate learning using either proficiency or letter grades for this year, along with descriptive feedback. So they'll have that choice. You might receive on your child's report on that communication, that learning update, you might receive information that's communicated using a proficiency, or some teachers might be using a grade. For teachers of courses in grades 10 to 12, they will all be using letter grades and percentages along with descriptive feedback. So no changes in grades 10 to 12. MyEd will be used for communicating student learning, and that's not a change either for secondary. That's been in place for a number of years. Now this brings us to the proficiency scale. I thought we could do a bit of a deeper dive into the proficiency scale and what it is. This is the 4-point proficiency scale, and it's used to communicate student learning in all areas of learning. And it will be the requirement starting next year for kindergarten to grade 9. You'll see those 4 different areas of proficiency. Emerging, where the student is demonstrating an initial understanding of the concepts and competencies relevant to the expected learning. For developing, the students are demonstrating a partial understanding of the concepts and competencies relevant to the expected learning. For proficient, students demonstrate a complete understanding. And then for extending, the student is able to demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of the concepts and competencies related to those expected learning areas. So you see the differences in language there with an initial, a partial, a complete, or sophisticated understanding demonstrated by the students. And this will provide a really clear picture of what students can do in their learning and areas for future growth. So put another way, and with a little bit more information for you, if we think about this proficiency scale, emerging indicates that a student is just beginning to demonstrate learning in relation to the learning standards, but might not be doing so consistently. But it's important to remember that emerging isn't failing. They're just emerging in their learning. They're at the beginning of this journey. And students who aren't yet demonstrating any learning can be assessed as emerging. If there's not enough evidence of learning yet, maybe the child just moved to the school, or maybe it's a child who's new to our country and doesn't have enough language for us to be able to assess their proficiency, then we will use IE, which stands for insufficient evidence. Students who are developing, well, this indicates that students are demonstrating growing consistency in relation to the learning standards. So the student is showing an initial understanding of understanding, but they're still in process of developing their competencies. And developing isn't failing. All students will be developing in some areas and at some times. I'm certainly developing in lots of things. Proficient is the standard, though, for students. It's when a student demonstrates the expected learning in relation to the learning standards. So proficient isn't synonymous with perfection. Instead, it's the student is able to demonstrate their learning consistently, or most of the time. And then there's extending, which also is not anonymous with perfection. It's when a student is able to show that their learning has increasing depth and complexity. It's not like a bonus or a reward. It doesn't mean that they've done more work. That doesn't matter, the amount of work. It's the quality of work and the evidence of learning. And extending is not the standard for all students. Proficient is. So if a student turned in all their work and demonstrated evidence of learning in all their learning standards, they're not automatically assigned to extending. They will probably be proficient, which is the standard for all students. So we could use a bike riding analogy to talk about proficiency, I think, because I think, we can all relate to when you first got your bike and you weren't sure what to do with it yet. And you could, figure out how to stand and hold it, maybe figure out where to put your feet. If somebody held on to the back of the seat, you could place your feet on the pedals. But you really needed that support from somebody else, and you weren't independent. And you're just learning the ins and outs of what the bike felt like, the weight of the bike, the feel of the bike, the size of the bike. But eventually, perhaps with a little support from somebody else, you might be moving along on your bike. You might have training wheels on your bike, and you might be able to pedal along and every so often be able to balance without using those training wheels, but you've hit that sweet spot. And that would be developing. You're just managing to acquire the skills and the competencies that are required to be a bike rider. So you're developing in that. And before you know it, you keep practicing, and all of a sudden you realize that you're independent and you're able to navigate things like hills. You're navigating the braking really proficiently. You're able to maneuver the bike really well. You can manage the bike over maybe a little bit trickier terrain, and you're independent and able to be independent most of the time. And then there's extending. And these would be the people who, turn out to be the mountain bikers who love to just adventure out there and challenge themselves to find, trails that get harder and harder, more and more adventurous. They're able to maybe go on the road and do all the hand signals that would be required for road riding. They are really independent and driving their own learning and pursuing their own interests in their mountain biking, their biking adventures. So that would be like an analogy of what that proficiency scale of emerging, developing, proficient, and extending could look like in bike riding terms. So the shift to proficiency really focuses on learning as a continuous process. It's not signaling that the learning ends at any time. Many bike riders I know who've been biking for decades are still driving their learning and so excited about the new trails that they're finding and the new challenges that they're posing for themselves. The proficiency scale really focuses with a better understanding of learning. So there's a really deep focus of the actual learning that's taking place. We're not just saying, oh, you're a mountain biker who's a B or an A student. It's really talking about what you're able to do as a mountain biker and maybe the next steps for your learning. The proficiency scale really also embeds student self-reflection and goal setting because they can see right on the scale what would be next for them. And they can reflect on where do they want to go in their learning. It empowers students to take ownership of their learning. And it really fosters a sense of hope where all children can see themselves on that scale. We'll use strength-based language for students, no matter where they are on that scale. And that creates that sense of belief in themselves, which encourages students to take challenges, to take risks, to try new things. And all of that encourages learning. It encourages them to persevere, and it creates this culture of learning. So for some real life examples, I think I would think about my doctor. So my doctor, he probably graduated about 30 years ago, and that's a pretty long time ago. But what's important to me right now isn't what he, the grades he achieved 30 years ago. I didn't ask him, what did you get on your, I don't know, physics 12 exam? I just want to know that he knows what he's doing as a doctor. I want to know that does he view learning as something that he's continuing to do over these last 30 years? He didn't just stop learning when he graduated from medical school, but that he's really been engaged in learning more and deepening his knowledge. I once asked him about his time in medical school and whether he was a straight A student. And he told me that he found all of the memorizing quite tedious and that he was actually somebody who really liked the applied part more. He loved labs and he loved working with patients. And, I'm really glad about that because what he learned 30 years ago, all the memorizing that he was asked to do, most of those things are not important anymore. The knowledge has grown and changed and the research has continued to develop. And so I'm really glad that he's somebody who continues to prioritize his learning and keep up to date with what's happening in the medical field. I want a doctor who really cares enough to be continually learning, who isn't just trying to reach an external reward of an A or a monetary goal, right? I'm really happy that he can personalize his learning and apply it to myself and everybody in my family. So, I mean, really, we want to make sure that he can be flexible with his learning and how he applies the research in different contexts so that it fits the needs of each of the individuals that he's working with. Proficiency really is, it's a focus on learning and learning as a real continuous process, whereas grades kind of signal that learning is over. And that personalized, flexible, and responsive piece, well, I think it's really important, especially when it comes to my doctor. And this takes time and it takes reflection and immersion in a culture of learning. And I know that that's what my doctor does. He's always going to conferences. He's always talking to colleagues, and that's important. Even our students, in today's world, proficiency is really important. All of my kids were educated here on the Sunshine Coast and graduated from our secondary schools. And, they applied for universities and their grades were part of what was considered, but they actually had to do other things than just grades. They had to show things like that they were leaders and that they were contributing citizens by their volunteer work. 2 of them actually had to do videos, live videos of themselves answering random questions. And this was through UBC, where they were given 30 seconds to look at a question and formulate an answer, and then 2 minutes to answer that question. And they were videoed live while they were doing those question and answer periods. And that really, I think, surfaced for the universities their competencies in communication, how well they could articulate their answers and formulate their answers and string those thoughts together. It really surfaced competencies around critical thinking. How well could they think about the question and think about what would be the best, most succinct answer to that question in those few minutes that they had? And creative thinking. How creative were they in coming up with those answers? So it's so interesting to see how our universities are shifting to become more competency-based as well and to value that. And when they do interviews now, 2 of them have graduated from university and, they're doing interviews and nobody's asking them what marks they got in, English 10 or math 9. Everybody's asking about, what's their critical thinking like? Can they answer a question in a way? They're often being asked in their interviews about their communication skills, and that's part of the interview process, is to be able to communicate well, to show that they can think critically. They're often doing tests even for some of their interviews. So interesting that there's problem solving built right into it. And flexible thinking, right? What they're being asked is, tell us about a time when you were able to think on your feet and answer or solve a problem. And that's what proficiency in today's world looks like. And that's why we have this focus on competencies. So the research has been really clear that grades tend to diminish students' interest in whatever they're learning. So students early on begin to focus on letter grades. And for those students that are motivated by them, the focus turns really quickly to a collection of points to achieve a grade, which is really an extrinsic reward for every level of achievement. The focus moves away from learning. And what we hope for is that we want our students to want to learn for learning's sake, to become lifelong learners. And a focus on letter grades can result in students looking for the easy road. It creates this preference for looking for the easiest possible task. We know that from the research. So research shows that students will consistently choose the easiest path to a good grade instead of the path that will help them move forward in their learning. and will help them meet their own personal goals. And for lots of students, research shows that letter grades demotivate them. They give up. They strive for mediocrity often as their belief in their ability changes and diminishes. They often lose hope and lose interest in their learning. Students ultimately feel like grades are sort of done to them instead of with them. And schooling can become a really painful process for learners and their families in that case. So now I'd like to introduce Desiree Harris, Vice Principal of Chatleach Secondary. Welcome, Desiree.
Hi, Kristen. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And I like that that's where Kristen left us with, because I was going to start by talking about some of the drawbacks to the traditional grading system and assessment and reporting system. And so much like Kirsten was just talking about, before using proficiency scales in the traditional system, we noticed that students are really concerned about how they can increase their mark or their grade rather than focusing on the learning and how they can improve their skills. And especially at the high school level, it's all surrounded on grades and percentages. So even just that number, and similar to what Kirsten was just saying, a lot of students end up like feeling quite judged by that number, and they internalize it, and it sort of defines them in their mind, and in some cases give up quite easily when they see a low number and feel kind of helpless, as though they can improve. And so school becomes kind of a task completion, and students are always asking, you know, is this for marks? And if the teacher's presenting an activity and the students know it's not for marks, then they don't necessarily want to participate, and so become disengaged, and it becomes less about the learning and more about the number. And so before coming to the Sunshine Coast, I worked in the Langley district, and I worked at a school where we were piloting the new reporting order. And so we used the proficiency scales in the school, and we noticed over time there was so many benefits for everyone, really, for the students especially, but also for the teachers, also for the families, and just the entire school community. So Kirsten just presented a lot of lovely information on the proficiency scales, and so you'll be familiar with those proficiencies. And so with the proficiency scales, those proficiency scales are, the language in them is tied to the curriculum with the competencies. And so with using the proficiency scales, students over time really start to focus on the language in those proficiency scales, and they can clearly see in those proficiency scales what they need to do to progress to the next level. And with the teacher feedback that's provided, because part of the new reporting order is having that descriptive feedback piece where the teacher is telling the student why they are at the level that they're at, and then clearly stating what they need to do in order to progress to the next level. The student then can take that feedback and apply it and really engage with that proficiency scale to see what they need to do to get to the next level. And then they can actually set goals for themselves and work towards those goals. And that's what we saw students doing. So students were much more engaged in the learning process. Over time, stopped asking what's my grade or what's my percentage, and just what can I do to improve and to move to the next level? How can I develop my skills? And so parents were also able to see clearly what was the criteria of the assignment, what did the student need to do to progress to the next level, which was also helpful for families when helping their child with their homework at home, or for understanding why their child got the place that they did on the scale. And the descriptive feedback piece also was really helpful for families, because they could understand, again, why the student got the level on the scale that they got and what they could do to improve. And so it made it a lot easier for families to understand and to work with the teacher and the student to progress the student. We also found that students were just more engaged with the curriculum itself, and we found they were less anxious and felt more capable. So they generally tried harder to understand what they needed to do to develop their skills. And once they understood, they could then set goals, and they felt more confidence in trying to progress to the next level. More confident in taking risks too, because one thing with the new reporting order is that the teacher can use a variety of sources of evidence of learning to assess the students. So they're not just relying on high stakes items like essays or tests. They're using things like conversations, conferences, group learning, discussions. Lots of things that are happening in the class are evidence of learning, and isn't necessarily always just only reflected on a test or an essay, things like that. So students become more engaged just on a daily basis in the classroom activities because they know that they're continuously able to display how they're learning and how they're progressing in their learning. Another great thing about the new reporting order and the proficiency scales is that they are giving a current, more accurate, reflective snapshot of where the student is currently at in their learning process when the reporting happens. So what I mean by that is if the student starts out at an emerging level, and as they continue to practice and take that feedback, the teacher feedback, and apply it and set goals and work towards their goals, and they progress to then consistently at a developing level and then consistently at a proficient level, then when that reporting time comes and they're at the proficient level, they will be placed at the proficient level on the scale, because that is where they are currently at. Whereas in the traditional system, the grades would be more averaged out or cumulative. And so the student would actually end up being penalized for that starting point of where they started at. And they would be more, showing up at like a C or B level when they should be more at maybe an A level. So that system is really like showing a more accurate representation of where the student is currently at in their learning. And so students are aware of that, and then they realize that, learning is more of a process, and then they're more willing to take those risks to try harder to progress in their learning, because they also know that they'll be rewarded for that in the end. And that it's not just this is where you're at and that's where you're at. The student always has the opportunity to apply the teacher feedback and progress along that scale, which again is more like, as Kirsten said, it's more like real life, where we don't always start out at the extending level or the proficient level when we're learning new things. We have to progress along the way. So we also noticed that students just asked for more feedback on their assignments. They started to really want that feedback because they knew that they could apply that feedback back and set those goals and then progress their learning. They took more opportunities to apply that feedback, whether it was on a future assignment or to resubmit an assignment. And they felt less judged on their place on the scale, because they understood that learning was a process. And that they could, through further practice and applying feedback, that they could progress through the levels. Teachers also, we noticed teachers also focused more on the curriculum, on the competencies. And so developing all those skills that Kristen was talking about that help students in their life, they're applicable to their life after graduation, and they're transferable skills. So those competencies become a really core focus and central aspect of the education process, which is really important. Yeah, so overall, with this new reporting order and the proficiency scale, it students can have more ownership over their learning. They can have more hope and efficacy, and just you know, hone in on those skills that they can use in life. And so yeah, in the pilot process that we went through, we really were able to see all these benefits. And so I'm really excited that it's coming into effect throughout the province. And I'll pass it back to you, Kirsten. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Desiree. It's really helps it come to life, that experience that, you know, you had actually in a school where teachers were, you know, writing all sorts of amazing comments and feedback and on assignments. But as soon as a mark was put at the top of that assignment, teachers noticed that the students didn't read the feedback anymore. They just looked at their mark and that was it. That was the end of the story. And students start to define themselves in terms of their marks. And really, we should be talking in terms of learning and growth. So thank you for sharing that, Desiree. So we've heard a lot about the benefits of proficiency scale and descriptive feedback, how it helps learning be perceived more as an ongoing process. The feedback on where they are and where they're going really helps to support them and students engage in their learning and supports that lifelong learning focus, which we all really want for our students and for ourselves. And that's what focusing on competencies and not marks will bring for us. And again, the high provincial standards will be maintained where we want all students to attain proficiency. That is the goal. Now, proficiency isn't new in School District 46, so all of our primary students have used the proficiency scale for a number of years now. All of our e-portfolio students have received information using the proficiency scale, so all the families who received updates and assessment using FreshGrade. And all of our nature program, the NEST program, also uses proficiency scale. So it's not new for many of us in the school district. We will be switching to using MyEd as the platform that will deliver our learning updates to families. So we'll be using MyEd to communicate proficiency or grades this year. Some teachers might be still using grades. And this will allow for us to practice ahead of time and really allow for a sort of supportive transition for us. Using MyEd is also really great because it provides that consistent platform that will indicate proficiency for all of our students. So everybody will be receiving this information using MyEd. It also allows for multiple teachers, so including itinerant teachers like music teachers or art teachers or reading teachers, to make comments and enter proficiency in MyEd, which is just such an efficient way for us to be collaborating as educators. And staff and students and families can easily access reports electronically, although we're not going to ask families to do that this year. We're going to print out the reports for families, but eventually you'll be able to access all of your children's reports and learning updates using MyEd, and you can go back in time. So that's a neat way to have the learning journey documented. And we're already using MyEd for attendance, for IEPs are all done on MyEd, and our secondaries are already using MyEd for their reporting. And as I said, this year we'll be providing paper copies of MyEd, and those will go home for families at every reporting period. Descriptive feedback in elementary, for those learning updates, teachers will use MyEd to indicate proficiency, but teachers will have a choice of 3 different ways that they might communicate their feedback to families. So these choices are, they might use the traditional word template that they've used in the past that some of you might have been receiving, and that'll just be stapled to your MyEd report. Some families might receive information on MyEd. So they might receive just the one report that has proficiency and descriptive feedback all in one. And other families might be receiving their descriptive feedback through the posts that their teachers are making on FreshGrade, and they might be having more ongoing communication with their teacher. So there's 3 different choices. So to put it another way, all families will be using MyEd to receive information about proficiency. So all families will receive information about proficiency over MyEd on a printed report that will come out. But you will be receiving descriptive feedback, maybe over Spaces posts that will happen throughout the year, or maybe you'll receive it on MyEd, right embedded into that report, or your descriptive feedback might be attached to your MyEd report. So those are the 3 choices. This is what a MyEd report looks like. This is what a learning update looks like for communicating student learning. It's Rufus Meow, so he's a pretend fellow for us. And but it shows you how easy it is to navigate. There's the proficiency is indicated right there for each learning area, and then the descriptive feedback will be either right behind it or right underneath it, or it will be stapled on a separate document. So that's what it looks like for MyEd. For the traditional reporting, you might have the MyEd document that we just showed you indicating proficiency, and then a document that was a traditional document that's been used in the past. For this year, some teachers might choose to continue to stick with that, but not next year. We won't be having that option next year. And some families might be receiving information in a more ongoing way because of their teacher might be using an e-portfolio platform. So that means that they'll be receiving their comments or descriptive feedback about their child's learning through posts. We are using the Spaces platform. So that will be what we use to replace FreshGrade. Many of you know that FreshGrade is not going to be used in our district anymore. It's not going to be used in Canada. And so we found the Spaces platform to be really an exciting, really robust e-portfolio platform, much more robust than FreshGrade ever was. So that's exciting. And the benefits of e-portfolios is that we get learning updates as learning happens in the classroom. We're not waiting for reporting summary in November or March or June. We get those updates and those assessment posts happening right as learning is happening. And it provides for a more reciprocal relationship in reporting where families are engaging and commenting and encouraging their students and their children to continue learning, and they're celebrating that with teachers and students. And it really allows us to capture learning in and what it looks like using lots of different forms. So we can capture that student engagement in videos and through audio files. We can take pictures and photos and post those. We can listen to our children reading and talk about, hear the conversations that they're having with other students and with the teacher. So there's multiple different forms that can be captured in an e-portfolio platform, which is really exciting. And teachers will be connecting with families ahead of time with more information about Spaces. There's a getting started guide for spaces that families will receive, and they'll be getting lots of information about how to be logging in and how to be engaging to celebrate and encourage their student. Even Spaces itself has amazing resources. So just at spaces.edu.com, there's tons of resources like video resources and written resources, podcasts, all sorts of things that can support families. So you'll be receiving all sorts of information about how to be engaging in this learning journey with your child and their teacher. So we've really been focusing on developing a communication plan about communicating student learning. So there's lots of different pathways for learning for families. Brochures from the ministry have been sent to all schools and emailed out to families. We've made our own School District 46 brochure that's also available for families and is in every school and has been emailed out. Families are going to be receiving information every 2 weeks until the first reporting period with information, different little bite-sized pieces of information. Parent advisories have also been engaging in this. So we've been presenting to the DPAC, and parent advisories will then have information through DPAC about what's happening with communicating student learning. We have this district-wide Zoom offered for families, and we'll be recording this session so that we can send the link out to families who might not have been able to join. I know many families were interested in participating and hearing about this. So we're going to make sure that families receive all of this information through all of those different methods. And of course, our teachers will have lots of information about this, and they'll be working with their students so that students are really knowledgeable about what proficiency is and will understand what it means to move through that proficiency scale. So timely communication, clear messaging, strategic and comprehensive approach is really our goal for this. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We so appreciate that you've taken the time to be here and to learn, to engage. We know how important your child's learning is, and we want to be doing this with you and engaging in this process of communicating student learning reciprocally with you. If you have questions anytime, please feel free to contact your school principal, or you can contact me. I've got my email there on the screen and my phone number, so you're welcome to contact me at any time if you have questions that we weren't able to answer tonight. We certainly did our best to answer all of your questions. Thank you for sending them ahead. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you so much for being here tonight.